And the first thing I'd like to say is that I was invited to present a lecture to the present audience with the description that the Post-Truth fiction program that was being assembled also wanted to have something more philosophical, more reflective on what is fiction today in so-called post-truth era. And I'm saying this so that you know that my lecture will be indeed relatively philosophical. I try to live up to this task. I enjoy living up to this task. This is what I like to do most. Philosophize about things. It's one of my passions. It's also what I studied. So it's a fairly philosophical-ish reflection in which I will not be presenting direct case studies on fiction, specific types of fiction, but in which I intend to indeed take you through what I like to call a couple of sequences, 5 sequences in total. It's not real. It is an argument that builds up, but the sequences are related to each other, but they're not a straightforward argument that like you'll expect from an academic in general. However, they are philosophical, and I'll try and take you through a couple of moments in the history of philosophy of art or philosophy of aesthetics or whatever we want to call it, about how we think about how we think about the relation between fiction and truth, and how that relation functions, or how in the history of philosophy, with reference to what interests us today, has been said about that relation between truth and fiction, or fiction and truth. Now, I've called the first movement or the first sequence is the same title as my paper. Fiction is not untrue. So fiction is not untrue. And that means that we cannot simply think of fiction as being the opposite of truth. And I'd like to go even further than that. I'd like to suggest to you today that fiction has never been perceived as downright false or untrue by any of the major Western philosophers that have influenced our Western modes of thinking about fiction. And as I look around the room, I expect that some of you will probably say, well, what about Plato? Plato, one of those founding philosophers of Western thought, is known for the fact, or supposedly known for the fact, that he rejected fiction. Indeed, he did. And we tend to think that he rejected fiction because fiction is untrue, fiction is false, fiction is misleading. Maybe misleading, but Plato actually never says that fiction is false or untrue. And that's precisely the force, I think, of Plato's arguments. So I'd like to take you through a couple of ideas without actually plunging into textual analysis today. I'd like to take you through a couple of ideas of Plato and how Plato thought about fiction. And hopefully I'll get you on board, I'll get you on my team of arguing that Plato was probably the one who acknowledged the force of fiction the most, rather than this person who is skeptical about and negative about fiction. Quite to the contrary. He's one of the major philosophers when it comes to acknowledging the force of fiction, of literary fiction. So, and the reason why that is that Plato, I would say, knew very well that people understand that fiction is not true in the literal sense. So Plato is not, contrary to what you might have read, perhaps in an introduction to philosophy or further explorations, Plato did not argue that people are so gullible that they're unable to distinguish between truth and fiction, between facts and fiction. Plato wasn't particularly scared about the facts that people might actually take a good literary fictive narrative for truth. Plato wasn't that dumb. He knew that people aren't that dumb. The argument that Plato makes against fiction is more complex. Plato understood, as we probably understand as well, that whenever we are grabbed or moved or touched, it's interesting that we have these tactile metaphors to explain it, but whenever we're moved or grabbed or touched by a literary work of fiction, we of course know that that fiction isn't true. That's also what allows us to go along with the narrative and with the fiction, with the event of that fiction in the first place. Knowing it's not true, we can sort of plunge into that literary narrative, plunge into that narrative, the story that is being told to us. And sometimes we're completely bored. Most of the books I read, I never finish because they're bored, and I have a principle: if I don't like the book, I just don't finish it. And I have that principle because I know it's probably not done not to finish books, so I like not to finish books. It's sort of small, minimal, micro-resistance against literature. But in any case, sometimes we do get enthralled by a book. Oftentimes we do get enthralled by a book, by a narrative, by the characters that are conjured up before our very eyes. And of course we know that these characters aren't actually true. We know that the events didn't actually take place. We're not so stupid as to think that this is actually true in a factual sense. But if you think about it, there is something more to this. The movement of thought that goes along with being grabbed by really good fiction, literary fiction, I would describe as, I know this isn't true, and yet, or but, or nevertheless. We tend to feel that even though literature isn't true, we are really moved and grabbed by it. And because we're moved and grabbed by it, we have that feeling that it touches upon something essential, that it's really something that matters. We cannot quite explain what it is that matters to us. We cannot quite explicate in a scientific manner what kind of allegorical truth, whatever you want to call it, literary fiction might then touch upon. And that also leads to the fact that we often don't actually mention this too explicitly. We don't actually talk about the fact that a book can leave you in tears or can leave you emptied out inside. I think we should talk about that more, because that feeling is an essential feeling, at least from the perspective of the reader. I think that's an essential feeling that literature, sometimes movies as well, narratives, literary narrative fiction in general, can sometimes incur upon you. And Plato knew this, I think. And that's precisely why Plato was against literature. Because as Plato understood this very well, he also knew the danger, the impact it has. Our lives can actually be changed by reading stories. And the best example is not the most beautiful example. It may not be your favorite book, but we have to acknowledge that one of the best examples of recent years, recent decades, has been Harry Potter. How many young people are really living that Harry Potter aura, which comes with its own problems. If you think about it, the stereotypical representation of youngsters in that novel is not without its own problems, and that's exactly what Plato also understood. So he understood that when people are really grabbed by novels, and people are grabbed by novels, even though they know it's not true, precisely because they know it's not true, they tend to feel there's something deeper to this. And even though I won't acknowledge it outright in the open, that yes, I'm a believer, or whatever. Does that believer? Yeah. I think Bieber is pretty good, but that's so we won't be open. It's sort of embarrassing to acknowledge that in the open, but precisely for that reason, on a subterranean level of thought, and of thinking about life and framing life, it's something we do take with us. It's something we do tend to take as a guiding principle or guiding ideas for our lives. That's the force of literature, and this is something that Plato feared, and I think rightly so. Even today, literature, literary fiction can be feared, or there's reason to understand that. Now, the fact that Plato actually thought about it this way can be easily demonstrated. Not just by referring to Book 5 of the State, where this, or Politeia as it's sometimes called, where Plato makes the argument, or Socrates makes the argument, but it's written by Plato, but by going to the Phaedo. And the Phaedo is an interesting dialogue because it's the last dialogue of Socrates. It's not the last dialogue written by Plato, though, but it's the last dialogue by Socrates, which means that it's the dialogue where Socrates holds a whole conversation about the immortality of the soul, and eventually drinks the poison that he's given in prison and dies. So, in that Phaedo, there are a couple of things that are really interesting, I think. First of all, it's a written dialogue, and it's written by Plato. It's narrated by Phaedo. But when asked about who were present, Phaedo said, well, he, Crito was present, a couple of other people that were close to Socrates were present, and he says, Plato, I believe, was ill. So that's already an indication of how subtle, what kind of subtle thinker Plato is about fiction. He's indicating that he wasn't there. So obviously, this whole dialogue must be fiction, or must be coming from hearsay. But the even more interesting thing is that the Phaedo presents you three arguments about the immortality of the soul. Or actually, to be more correct, it presents you two arguments, rational arguments about the immortality of the soul. And then finally, it presents you a narrative, a speculative account, state-of-the-art science fiction, I would say, about the way that the afterlife is constructed, and how the earth is constructed in such a way that an afterlife in which the soul will continue and will be recycled, so to speak, is depicted through literary fiction. And having given that account, Plato then says, Socrates then says, and I'm quoting Socrates here, a man of sense, whatever that may be, a man of sense ought not to say, nor will I be very confident that the description which I have given of the soul and her mansions is exactly true. But I do say that inasmuch as the soul is shown to be immortal, he may venture to think, not improperly or unworthily, that something of the kind is true. The venture of thinking that this is true is, Socrates said, a glorious one, and he ought to comfort himself with the words like these, which is the reason why I lengthen out the tale. So I think it's really pivotal and significant that Socrates ends his career as a philosopher who's always criticizing fiction, always being skeptical to fiction, ends his career as a philosopher with a literary narrative about the afterlife, rather than with an argument. And then he says, indeed, what I think is precisely the issue with fiction, that we know it's not exactly true, but we nevertheless venture to think that something of the kind is true, that there may be a deeper truth to this. So in a sense, I greatly admire Plato's argument, because Plato, reading Plato can really drive home the fact that indeed literature, literary fiction, does have an effect upon us, and that lengthening out the tale, as Socrates called it, and afterwards he then quite immediately goes on to drink that poison, lengthening out the tale is really what life may be about. So, kudos for Plato. Second sequence. Second sequence I'd like to call commonality. I don't like to call it, I actually called it commonality of art. So, what the argument on the impact of fiction and so-called deeper truth it speaks to it speaks to, indicates, I think, is that literary fiction is a social or communal affair, and not just a personal affair. So let me explain that to you. I've just explained, or just tried to argue, by way of Plato, that literature actually grabs us. And by us, I mean you, as a reader, reading in wherever you happen to or like to read. But so that would seem that it's an individual issue, that it's you personally who is grabbed by this. But there's more to this deeper truth or allegorical truth or whatever we want to call it, that we, as readers, even if we don't actually acknowledge it explicitly, think may be present in a book that really grabs us. Whenever we're really grabbed by a literary work of fiction, there is this sense of, well, I think urgency present in that literary work of fiction, or in the way that we deal with that literary work of fiction. And what I mean by that is that we know, of course, that it's just me who's being grabbed by this literary work of fiction, who's being touched and who's being brought to tears. And we know that it's not actually true in a literal sense, but nevertheless we feel that there is some deeper truth to it. And as it's truth, as we tend to think of it as truth, even if we don't like to mention that as such in such explicit terms, we also tend to think that it holds a more general validity, that it's not just me. That's the phrasing, I think, that grabs that phenomenon best. It's not just me. It can't be just me. Certainly other people will be moved by this as well. And when you recommend a singer-songwriter, or when you recommend poetry or a novel or what have you, anything that comes close to that phenomenon of narrative and conjuring up that story, and you recommend it to someone, and that person is utterly unmoved, you simply go, oh, really? And what we really think is, you stupid bastard, are you fucking daft? That's what you really mean. What you really mean is, how is it possible that you're not moved by it? Are you blind? That's what we really mean, I think. That's what we'd say if we didn't have the politeness not to say it so outright. So I think when it comes to come to terms with that phenomenon, that we tend to think that it's not just me, it must have a wider validity. A philosopher, another Western philosopher who's greatly influenced our Western mode of thinking is Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant perhaps tried to hardest, in a sense, but also criticizing in a minute, to come to terms with that phenomena of it's not just me. And he's done so in exceedingly boring read, but an exceedingly exciting read from an intellectual perspective, the critique of the power of judgment. Power of critique of judgment? It's not actually. It's translated as Kritik der Urteilskraft. That's basically what it's called in German. There are different translations in English. And it's translated as Critique of the Power of Judgment in the Cambridge edition. So what Kant says is that since when we're reading or when we're touched by something beautiful, Kant focuses on the more general issue of the beautiful. When we're touched by something truly beautiful, that sense of pleasure that we derive from it, that we experience, is not based on any specific inclination of the subject. That's the quote. It's not based on an inclination of the subject. And what Kant meant by this, I think, is that we don't have any personal interest, or in Kant's words, underlying interest, or private conditions that can explain why we're so moved by a specific literary work of fiction or by something specifically beautiful that we find specifically beautiful. So we don't have anything to gain aside from having that feeling of that experience of something beautiful, of being moved. We don't really have anything to gain from experiencing the beautiful. We don't actually get more money or power, to speak very frankly, by looking on art, by reading fiction, we don't really, there's not really anything in there for me personally when it comes to these worldly affairs in the quite cynical way, power and money. And since that's the case, since there's no underlying interest, Kant says, since there are no private conditions that can explain to us why we're so moved, we have grounds, we cannot think otherwise than thinking that we have ground for expecting a similar pleasure of everyone. That's a quote from Kant. We have ground for expecting a similar pleasure of everyone. So, if you think about Kant's argument, it's a really fascinating argument. Because on the one hand, Kant acknowledges, just like Plato and just like many other people have done so, that indeed the experience of the beautiful, the experience of being moved by a literary work of fiction in our particular case, is subjective. At the same time, he argues, convincingly up to a certain extent, I say, that it's also universal. And that's weird, because if it's subjective in less jargon-like terms, if it's personal, then how can it be universal? How can it have a more general validity, indeed even a universal validity to our mind? Well, Kant has a way of explaining this. He has a way of explaining this with which I don't quite want to agree, and that's where the commonality of art comes in. Kant developed a theory of the sensus communis, of the common sense, that can explain to us why a subjective feeling, a subjective judgment really, of something being beautiful or of being moved by something is also at the same time universal. And the reason why this is so for Kant is because, he says, the reason why we think that everyone should feel the same way is because the subjective, that experience of the beautiful has no concept. And what he really means by concepts is, or what he means in more simple terms, is it has no contents. And this is something I'd like to object to. It has no content, he says. It has no content in the sense that the reason why we feel that everyone should agree with us that a certain thing is beautiful is because the judgment that we're making is a judgment with no universal concept. So it's an empty concept. And what it simply points us to is the way our mind works. So Kant, actually really taking the first step into cognitive sciences here, said, well, the reason why we have that feeling that everyone should think about this, and that this is part of common sense, that this is indeed beautiful, and that it's a universal, that it has universal validity rather than subjective validity, is because we all have the same mind, so the structure of our mind, the way our mind works, for all humans is the same. So this is a very formal argument. So he said because it has no content, it has no concept, it simply has that same structure. All our minds have that same structure, cognitive structure, and that's why we feel that there's something common, something generally, universally valid when we perceive the beautiful, when we come to the conclusion that something is beautiful. But it also means that this concept of common sense or sensus communis that Kant introduced, and that over the decades and centuries would be pondered over again and again by many philosophers, from Hannah Arendt, who probably did the best work, to Jean-François Lyotard, who you don't really need to keep in mind for this particular project. They all try to come to terms with this idea of common sense, but what I think is problematic is that even though Kant explains to us why we feel that there's a universal validity, something universal to literature, something singular and yet universal, you can only do so by suggesting that really it's just a formal issue. It's just formalism. It's just the way things are structured. It's just the way our mind is structured. And I think most of us know, or at least feel, in an irrational way, perhaps, but we still feel that there's something more to it, that indeed literature has content by excellence, that literature is full of content, that it's precisely that content that is really what we are so grabbed by. Because sometimes we can be grabbed by something that's not really written very well, that's stylistically not really beautiful, but we can still be grabbed by it immensely. Perhaps literary Harry Potter could serve me as an example, although I personally think that stylistically it's pretty well done. But I mean, so it's not just about style, it's not just about form that we're touched by the beautiful, it's about content. So this event perhaps points us to the fact that we should press on in considering what this commonality, this common sense or commonality is, something that we tend to hold in common, that we somehow feel that is important about literary fiction. And what is important about literary fiction is not just its form, even though that may go a long way as well, it's really its content. And that content over which there's always disagreement about what specifically it says or signifies or intends to communicate, that content and the senses, the disagreement over the exact meaning of that content, perhaps that's really what the commonality of art is about. Perhaps it's not so much about the form, but rather about not just the content, but the disagreement about the content, the discussion that is launched by that content, rather than by the forms. Now, the third movement, or third sequence, is about committing to it and owning it. And here I'm moving closer to present-day history, literary theory and literary history. If you think about what I've just been saying, if you think about Plato, if you think about Kant, all of this was really about the reader, the perceiver, the one who views art, rather than the one who makes art, who produces art, who produces literary fiction. So it's all been about that one side of the spectrum, the reader, Frank simply put. But how about the other side of the literary spectrum? How about the author? A focus on authorship, and a focus on the author and his or her responsibilities and task when it comes to producing literary fiction is something that hasn't been considered for too long, if you look at that history of Western aesthetics. It's been around for a couple hundred years now that we've come to realize that there's such a thing as an author. And for any one of you who's read The Death of the Author by Roland Barthes, have heard of it, that's really what Roland Barthes was about. Roland Barthes wasn't saying that there was no such thing as an author. He was simply saying that the figure of the author was constructed over the course of a couple of centuries, and that at the very latest, in the late 19th century, he was referring specifically to Mallarmé. We can see how that concept of an author is shifting, is transforming, perhaps even disappearing. And we sort of return back to the reader, that death of the author is the birth of the reader, he concluded in that essay. But when we think about the author, I still think it has a function. I still think it's relevant. And the reason why that is because what distinguishes literary fiction from simple writing, which is certainly not simple when it comes to doing it, is that literary fiction, for it to become literature, to become something that I think is always within the public sphere, it has to be published. So I'd like to suggest that what distinguishes an author from a writer, which is not a qualitative distinction, it's simply a way of going about what you've written or what you are writing, that an author is someone who has, or who publishes his or her writing, who sort of throws it out there in the public domain, pushes it into the public domain. So it's about narratives and stories that become public, that are not just written down in the safety of your own bedroom, but are told to the people on the street by any means necessary. So sometimes, and oftentimes, this will be by publishing a book and getting it published. Sometimes this can simply be by telling a story to a friend. That also is a minimal form of authorship, when you start telling a story to someone else, when there's this community of storytellers and or listeners, so to speak. That's when we get that weird phenomenon that I'd call literature. And in that general sense, I think, authorship and literature always presupposes a minimal form of social commitment. A minimal form of social commitment in that sense that even when the author refuses to engage with political issues in any way whatsoever, any straightforward way whatsoever, even when the writer takes it upon himself to write about the most personal things, the fact that these personal things, or this complete mumbo-jumbo fiction, is thrown out there in the public domain for everyone to read, potentially, even if no one actually does, perhaps, that means that there's a form of social commitment. This doesn't actually necessarily have to mean that you're writing political fiction, but it does mean that there is a political side to the whole process of literature, of getting your work out there. Because what happens then is that people will suppose that people start to read this. And the thing is that you will have to take public ownership over it. So you'll be held accountable for what you say. Now, you won't be held accountable as a writer of fiction. You will not be held accountable for what your characters say, or even what your narrator says, but you will be held accountable for the fact that it's out there, that you've written about this and that you've authored a polyphonous, wayward, difficult to contextualize form of writing that's out there. So you can always say, I think you have the right and probably the task of saying, what that character says doesn't necessarily reflect my views as a public figure, as an author. But you will also have to say, but indeed, I authored this book. I thought, at this point in time, that it might be a good idea to bring these voices, which I created, into the public, for you to think about, for you to ponder. And that does come with a sort of a form of commitment. What I'd like to call, you have to own it. So an author is the owner of his fiction, not in the sense that he has or she has control over that fiction, because, as I just said, that process of trying to make sense of the fiction is always a communal process of disagreement, and that goes for the author as well. The author is not the one who can decide on the actual meaning necessarily, but he or she is the one who takes ownership, public ownership, not private ownership, public ownership over the work. He or she is the one who says, yeah, I thought it might have been a good idea to put this out in the world at this specific time. And that's something that that can be, when you think about it, really fascinating, because implicitly I've been referring to the work of Roland Barthes for the past 5 minutes, and Roland Barthes, who talked about this idea of the death of the author is the birth of the reader. And this is true up to a certain extent, but at the same time we can also see that the author is at the very center of literature and literary things right now. And I don't just mean the author as a celebrity, that's also an issue, but also the author in the sense of right now, in an era of post-truth, but also in an era where narrative structures may be prone to restructuring, to rethinking. The question becomes ever more pressing to think, what does the author say? What does the author own? And we can still agree that no, the author doesn't have direct responsibility for what his characters say, but the author does have a certain responsibility for what he or she has to say as a public person and for the act of putting literature out there, that comes with a certain responsibility, I think. And in that sense, maybe indeed I am harking back to Plato, who also is keenly aware of that responsibility, though from a more dictatorial point of view, I think. So, that was the third movement. There are two more movements to go. Fourth movement, imagine community. So how does all of this relate then to the contemporary situation? Well, we've just established that what defines literature, what defines literary fiction is not, or is that it's impossible to ascribe the comments and ideas of the character or narrator to the author. But that we can still think of the author as someone who puts something forth in the public. And that there is a minimal form of social, perhaps even political commitment to carrying your work out into the public. That this comes with certain consequences, that you have to own it. Because what you're doing is you may not directly, if all goes well, you're not presenting some sort of social realism where every character has the single purpose of presenting one monolithic view on politics or society or etc. But what you are doing is you're presenting contemporary genre literary fiction, you're presenting a polyphony of voices or a polyphony of ideas, of ways of living, ways of seeing the world, ways of engaging with the world, displayed or played out among these different personae, characters, or narrators that you're using. And you're putting them there out into the world for people to ponder, not for people to grasp the immediate truth of, but for people to have the feeling that there is some deeper truth which I cannot exactly explain to it. That's what we feel. There's a deeper truth, I cannot exactly explain it. Novels are often contradictory because of that polyphony of voices. So because of that, we cannot exactly strictly delineate the deeper truth, that idea of deeper truth when reading a novel, but we do tend to ponder over it. We do tend to think about it. So novels are triggering, fueling our imagination, or communal imagination, or shared imagination, perhaps even our political imagination, even when they're not about politics, even when they're bedroom stories, coming-of-age stories, as we tend to see a lot. Even when they're coming-of-age stories, the question still is, what does it mean, and how does it feel to be coming of age in this particular time, in this particular geographical circumstances? And why does it grab me so much to read about it? That even if I'm quickly turning into an old man, as I read these books, and the distance between me and these debutantes who are writing coming-of-age novels is growing, I'm still grabbed by it, I'm still moved by it, even if it's not my own experience, maybe precisely because it's not my own experience. And many readers think about it like that. So even then, there's a political issue about this. We sort of feel that we're getting in touch, we're getting a view from elsewhere that we couldn't access any other way, and that does communicate something essential to us. Apologies. I've caught a little cold, I'm afraid. Usually my voice is higher than it is today. So there's something political about it. I think literature in that sense, literary fiction, contributes to a political imagination. Now, with that political imagination, an author whom I value greatly and who died deceased 2 years ago, Benedict Anderson, wrote a wonderful book, wonderful study on the rise of nationalism. It was called Imagine Communities. And what Anderson argued is that communities are always imagined. Any kind of community is imagined. What he means by it is that we don't know all of the members of our community. Even if we're living in a very primordial village, we probably don't even know all these people. And that means that for us to identify with a community, to feel as if we're Dutch or Belgian, in my case, or whatever, for that to allow that to happen, we need media structures and political structures that will facilitate that imagination. And that's what he says is what imagined communities are about. And he makes a study of the rise of nationalism. And what he's arguing, what I value greatly, is that there are two things that were happening or that took place when it comes to the creation of an imagined community. First of all, he said, in the 16th and 17th century, there was a rise of certain media structures. The printing press, first, and then secondly, more recently, the emergence of the rise in popularity of the newspaper. And another issue that's really important, he says, was the waning of religion. Now, I won't be boring you today with the intricacies of this argument, which I should say are pretty beautiful, and also eminently readable for an academic book, and also freely downloadable online, in case you're interested. But when we think about our own situation, and our own situation, I would say the post-1945 era, which is my final reflection or sequence, then I think we can see that the media infrastructures that have built up nationalism, that have allowed the nation-state and its political imagination to take shape and to solidify into something that is very strongly in place within our political realm. And I think that these media infrastructures have been changing significantly. And not just these media infrastructures. I think 1945 is an interesting, even though allegorical, date to use to mark off a change, a political change in our world. Not just because of the end of the Second World War, that obviously is of great importance, but also because the Second World War was the cradle of digital infrastructures. It was the moment when computers were developed, or the basic ideas for computer operations were developed, which we're now really feeling the consequences of. And also, very importantly, I think, something I won't be touching upon in my paper too extensively, but really crucial, it's the first wave of decolonization. So 1945 is not just the end of the Second World War, it's also the beginning of successful forms of decolonization in Africa, in the Southeast. And in that sense, perhaps also the moment when Europe, as a specific part of the West, loses its political hegemony, even though in recent decades we've launched ourselves in new neo-colonial wars, specifically in the Middle East. I still think that 1945 stands as a moment when Europe loses its political hegemony, and perhaps even a nation-state also starts to lose its political hegemony, its political dominance. And you can see this in Europe itself. In Europe itself, 1945 also signaled the beginning of the European Union, or actually 1948, and Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg were involved in starting up this process, of course, in 1948. So, when it comes to these digital infrastructures, these eventually have brought us to new information structures. We no longer read that newspaper, that national newspaper, or if we do, we read it in a sequence or in a combination with Facebook or True Facebook or other social media, which are now our main news providers, but also something that almost everyone has and deals with. We also we have seen the rise of new political structures, post-national political structures. But what we haven't seen is the rise of a new form of imagination. So that political imagination of the nation state, that according to Anderson was developed in the 17th and 18th century with the rise of the newspaper, that national newspaper that presented to us that fiction of we are a nation and we all read at the same time about the same things, has been replaced, as far as media infrastructure is concerned, with filter bubble, as we tend to call them, with the fact that we're all reading the things we want to read, and more specifically, I think, we're all commenting or conversing with people who are all like-minded. But what we haven't been able to do, or what the European Union in any case hasn't shown any interest whatsoever in doing, is in fueling or building up a new political imagination that would allow us to think beyond the nation state, to think of communities beyond the nation state. So in this sense, the European community really is no community. It's a community as far as neoliberal or as far as economic infrastructure is concerned, and it's a community as far as political regulations are concerned, and I'm certainly not against that, but it is definitely not a community when it comes to grassroots communities, when it comes to felt and lived experience. It's definitely not a community in the sense that I cannot quite define it, but I know there's something more profound to the Dutch nation state in a deeper sense. Now, this is where I'd like to return to fiction and literary fiction. Because what nationalism has done, and what you can see in the discourse, a hugely successful discourse of neo-nationalists or late nationalists or irrational nationalists or whatever you want to call it here, Wilders could be an example, is that they appeal to something deeper seated. I know that it doesn't really mean a thing that I'm Dutch. I'm not Dutch, but you want it. As a Belgian, I'm intimately aware of the fact that it really doesn't mean a thing, but still. As Dutch people in my experience, they know, and I appreciate that they know that being Dutch doesn't actually mean anything. But still, there's something, and it's more than just the wonderful infrastructure that we have in this country. There's something there. So imagine you are being bombarded with news from all over the world, which you no longer can escape. When you're living in Brabant or Limburg, the NOS, that's just Randstad. Nobody cares about that shit. That doesn't appeal to us. But now you're on Facebook with all of your friends, and whether you like it or not, what these silly people are doing in the Randstad now actually gets into your living room. It's no way of avoiding it. If it gets enough likes, you'll get it on your Facebook page. And then of course you can share your discontent about it within your filter bubble, but you cannot escape that news, that post-national phenomena and post-national infrastructure and politics. And then you feel, but there is something to the Netherlands, there's something Dutch. I cannot quite explain it, but it's deeper seated, which is quite like that phenomena of literature in many respects. And then you have people that actually plunge into that hole that will feed on that sense of community or commonality, that felt communality. And they'll be hugely successful, understandably, because we don't really have a living post-national form of imagination. So here's my question to you, or what I think might be a task for literature. Literature, literary fiction, in a sense, as I tried to explain, works with that same deeper-seated felt idea of commonality, though it's one that revolves around disagreement rather than about this shared fiction of national identity or whatever. It sort of feeds on that. And then if you care to look into it, you'll see that the novel as a genre, its rise and its demise perhaps as well, or its reconfiguration, goes hand in hand with the rise and demise of the nation state. So what kind of new writing do we need today? What kind of literary fictions do we want to craft today, or could we craft today, that can trigger or fuel our political imagination, that can trigger or fuel that idea of commonality, of common sense, of sensus communis and disagreement in the light of what we're seeing now when it comes to the reorganization of these information structures without us actually having a post-national imagination. It seems to me that that is one of the key questions, or key opportunities perhaps, for fiction today, to embark on reflecting on that question. And now, I'll admit right away, I don't have an answer to that question. That would be quite something. That would be world news, perhaps, who knows. I don't think anyone should claim to have that answer. Rather, I think it should be a whole array of explorations, of critiques, of probes and experiments, literary as well as philosophical, about how we could craft that political imagination through fiction. Not focused on agreements, on identity and consensus, but rather focused on disagreements, disobedience, not disarray. So that's, I think, an opportunity for fiction in a post-truth era. And that was that's my final sequence of thought, I suppose, and also think something that could be relevant today, specifically with regard to post-truth fiction. And as a final word, I know that this sort of imposes quite some weight on those who are writing literary fiction. And it's an easy thing to say for someone who does not write literary fiction. That would be me. Nevertheless, this is the sterility of the philosopher, suggesting things like, you might try this, you might try that, and that's really all you can do, I think, as a theoretician. I mean, there are other things you can do on a practical level of coming up with possibilities of imagination, political imagination. But in the end, I think Plato was right. You can argue about, this is what we should be doing, that is what we should be doing, this might be a possibility. But in the end, even Socrates, his final words were a literary narrative. And so in that sense, I think perhaps I should not, as a theoretician, I cannot have the last word, and I certainly can't come up with a narrative, unfortunately, otherwise I'd be doing it. I think writers, writing in the world, so to speak, should have that last word. Thank you.